How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 195 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, we're going to look at the topic of autumn planting and spring flowering bulbs. And I suppose over the last few weeks, we've mentioned it a little bit when it comes to your winter containers and the addition of bulbs into that. So we have spoken about it a little bit, but we're going to talk about it in a more, I suppose, more complete way now, and just talk about the different types of plantings, how to use, top tips for success, and so on. And I suppose the weather over the last couple of weeks is not really helping gardening in general, but it's certainly not helping bulbs because they do like to be dry. And we've just had in the last week, we've just had Storm Agnes here in Ireland, and torrential rain fell pretty much across the country, particularly in the south. And that's not going to help, bulbs and bulb planting, but we will definitely get dry weather. And the window for planting, it's not coming to an end anytime soon. So there is a bit of time to still do this. The big things to look out for, and we'll talk about the various types of bulbs. The big thing to look out for is not to have your bulbs sitting in water. They can't be waterlogged. They do like, dry, free draining soil as much as possible. Because if you can envisage, this is a small bulb, packed full of possibility, packed full of energy. So there's lots of, as I say, energy and potential within that. And everything that bulb needs to flower is within the bulb itself. The flowering head and all of that is already sort of formed in there. And the energy and everything is built into that, ready to pop out in the springtime. So it doesn't need much help from you. The only thing it does need is that it doesn't like to sit in water. If you think of any type of bulb or tuber, that's generally the case. They are quite vulnerable if they sit in damp. So that's the biggest thing and the most important thing to watch out for. So when we talk about autumn planting bulbs, there's lots of different types, and we're talking about things like snowdrops, crocuses, tulips, daffodils, narcissus, bluebells, hyacinths, alliums, ranunculus, iris reticulatas, fritillarias, wood anemones. There's lots of different bulbs, and the possibilities for planting, the situations for planting are endless. And we spoke about it before when I covered an episode along these lines last year. I mentioned, the bulbs is one thing, especially the naturalizing ones. When you put a bulb into the ground this year, you put 10 in, and then the following year you have 15, the following year you have 20, and they keep multiplying and increasing. And I'm pretty sure I said it last year, but there's not much that you would buy, across any section of your life that will increase in value and multiply the way something like a flower bulb does. So as I say, you put in 10, and that number will become over time 50, 100, and so on. So they really are superb value, and they give great color for years and years to come with pretty much no effort, because as I said, everything the bulb needs is already within the bulb. And especially if you're planted in the open ground, and if they're allowed to die back down, they take their energy from the dying back leaves, from the soil around them, and then they get themselves ready. They split and divide and get themselves ready to go again the following year. And it's an amazing cycle when you think about it. And if you're choosing naturalizing bulbs, they will give years and years and years of endless color, increasing all the time and looking better. And as a gardener, when people see that and see it done well, they're going to think you're doing amazing things and that you're an amazing gardener. But to be fair, anybody can do this. In planters, it's pretty much the same thing. The only thing I would say is that there's a little bit more care needed in planters, both at the point of view when you're starting planting, but also at the end. And we'll talk about those as well. So, and there's lots of, different ways of doing it, lots of ideas. I see, in the last couple of weeks, every second video that you see online is in relation to lasagna planting, and we'll go through that as well. And we'll look at, possibilities for lasagna planting. I'll give you my thoughts on it, and maybe look at some other ideas for creating superb flower in your garden. So, as I say, the importance of bulbs is huge. They give you that spring color. Some of the earliest flowers of the year are bulbs, things like snowdrops and crocuses. And so they give great hope and great color in an early season garden. They also are the first signs of spring, I suppose. So they bring a bit of cheer after winter time. They bring that cheer, that spring anticipation that the gardening season is about to kick off again. And they are the first flowers of that generally. So that's why they're kind of important. They're also so useful because they can be used, as I say, in pots, in the open ground. They can be used in, borders. They can be used in so many different ways, and that gives you that great versatility with them. They naturalize, as I mentioned earlier. So naturalize basically means that they spread and naturalize an area. They multiply, and they naturalize and make an area look natural, I guess, is the name says it all. But they naturalize and they spread, and they can be perfect in lawns, perfect. Certain bunds can be perfect in shaded areas. And that effect and that spring color is fantastic. Then there, as I say, another important factor with them is the early season pollen. So people don't often think of this, but you do, especially if you get some sort of milder weather in the springtime, in the early springtime, they provide, and you get bees coming out, and they provide early season pollen, things like crocuses, particularly bluebells also. And so that's another great reason to plant them. They multiply, as I said already. So there's so many great reasons to plant autumn planting spring flowering bulbs. The big thing, as I said, is drainage. So let's look at containers first. And if you're going planting bulbs in containers, there's, I suppose, loads of ways of doing it. But regardless of what container you're using, regardless of what planting system you're using, and I'll talk about that in a second, the biggest, most critical thing is to firstly, make sure that there is drainage holes in your pots. If there isn't, make sure you put them in it, because they cannot survive in waterlogged or heavy wet ground. Then your compost or your potting mix, that needs to be free draining. And a really good piece of advice here is to go back to, the potting mix that we spoke about before a couple of weeks ago, where you're adding in grit, you're adding in farmyard manure, you're adding in good quality compost, and that potting mix is giving you a nutrient-rich potting mix, but also a really free draining mix. And that couldn't be more important than it is in the wintertime. So that's the biggest thing. Now, when I said planting systems, as I mentioned, there's a huge amount of talk about lasagna planting. So we'll look at that first. And lasagna planting basically is a way of mixing different types of bulbs within the same pot that will flower at different flowering periods. And that gives you flower over a long period of time. Many of these bulbs, tulips, crocuses, daffodils, if you plant them a single variety in a pot, you're probably going to get, maximum of a month of decent flower. And that's a maximum. Typically, a tulip will look in its prime maybe for 2 to 3 weeks, will look prime and will be, looking really good. And so if you pot up a container and then you get 3 weeks of good color out of it from your bulbs, it's a little bit underwhelming. Fantastic for the 2 to 3 weeks, but over the period of, several months, you would like to see a little bit more, I suppose, continuity in the flower that you're going to get from these. So this is where lasagna planting has come in. It was used as a way originally of bringing flower over a longer period of time, particularly in gardens where space was limited. Really, really good. As I say, everybody, if you look at, all the social media channels, everybody is planting up lasagna planting. It's a buzz thing at the moment. My idea on it is that it can look really well. But the one thing I would say is that you get these different bulbs with different flowering periods. But when a bulb is finished flowering, you still have this leaf and stalk. And in order to have strong bulbs for the following season, they should be allowed to die back naturally into the bulb. And this is where I find a little bit of a I suppose, a reservation around lasagna planting is that if you want to allow it to die back down, then you're going to have to leave that growth there. Now, okay, you can kind of bunch it up and roll it up and tie it up so that it looks a little bit tidier. But in general, I think that the dying back leaves of your early flowers can take from your display later on in the season. So that's just one little concern around it. That's not to say it doesn't work. It does work. Everybody, as I say, everybody's showing you how to do it online at the moment, and it is a really, really good way of getting flowering over a long period. But that's a little reservation I have around it. So what is a bulb lasagna, and how would you go about it? So it can be a very, very simple bulb lasagna. Essentially, what it means is that you're putting your bigger bulbs deepest in the pot. And typically what you're looking for is different flowering times. So a really simple bulb lasagna, for example, would be tulips, and you might get 3 different varieties that all flower. You'll have a really early flowering one, you'll have a mid-season one, and you'll have a late one. And now you're getting this flower over a longer period of time. So you remember when I said, prime flowering for tulips, for example, might be 2 to 3 weeks. But if you're getting 2 to 3 weeks from each of your 3 varieties, now you're starting to get a display over a longer period of time. And, that's essentially a bulb lasagna. You can do the same thing, again, a simple one with, daffodils or narcissus, again, different flowering periods. Or you can do mixed ones, and mixed ones would be something like you get a pot, again, making sure it's drained or it has drainage holes, making sure that you're using a good open potting mix. And your first layer, so you put about you fill about a third of the pot with your potting mix. And then your first layer of bulbs might be your tulips, for example. And they're going to be the latest flowering. Then you put your compost back in on top of it. Your tulips, by the way, or any of the bulbs, as we talk about it, can be planted quite heavily within the the container. Just don't have the bulbs touching one another. They don't like that. They need a bit of space between them. So even the width of your finger in between each bulb, and the same out to the sides of the pot. So don't have them touching off the side of the pot. And again, that means that you're not getting a situation where water is actually holding or lodging in a particular point. So for example, if your bulbs are touching one another, you will get a bit of water holding and lodging at the point of where they touch. And that then can create a little bit of rot in it. So always have, the width or the thickness of your finger between each bulb and between the outside of the pot. So that's your first layer of tulips. On top of that, you're going to cover it with compost again. Then your next layer will be your narcissus, for example. Again, they're going to be, a later, they're going to be an earlier flower. So your tulip's going to be your late flower. Your narcissus is going to be your next flower, your earlier flower, and then cover with compost again. The same principles. Don't have the bulbs touching. Don't have it touching the side of the pot. Cover over again with your compost, your potting mix, and then on top a layer of crocuses or early flowering iris, reticulata, some of those, and that's going to give you your lasagna, your layering of flowers. And so that's a more, I suppose, complex mix of a more complex mix of flowers. So you can have the very, very simple lasagna, or you can have sort of mixed ones. And you will see mixes with 5, 6 different types, actually even more. People might mix the varieties of the tulips, they might mix the varieties of the narcissus or the daffodils, and they might mix the varieties of the crocuses or iris up on top. And so you're getting all this different color. And it is going to give you that longer period of flowering. My only, as I said, reservation with that planting system is that, in terms of the leaf dieback, which is important to keep your bulbs strong for the following year, they can look a little bit untidy as they're transitioning. So as one is dying back and the other one is coming through, the dying back and the stalky bits are taken from the flower, in my opinion. So That's not to say it doesn't have a place, it absolutely does. But I want to just mention a kind of another idea and a really good way of doing it, I think. So most of us has, as I said, lasagna planting was originally designed, I suppose, for small gardens. So people who don't have access to space, for maybe, like a greenhouse or an area that they can sort of have a small nursery in the corner, say, type of an idea. And because of that, then this is why they were packing so much into a single pot. And that makes sense from that perspective. If you're not as stuck on space, I think the idea of basically having a pot. So if you take most of the pots that you're going to put your bulbs into that are going to go on at your front door, going to go at your patio, are going to go around your house, they're going to be decorative pots, generally speaking. And if you're doing them, filling them with bulbs, and if you're looking to keep them looking fresh and well all the time, I find a better idea is to get a really cheap grow pot that is the same, slightly smaller than your nice looking decorative pot, and you use that as a kind of a sleeve, a bit like what you do with houseplants. So you have your houseplants, you get a really nice outer pot, and then you just drop your houseplant into it, and then if you wanted to switch it, you just take out your houseplant, all still in its same pot, and then you put in a new pot into your decorative outer pot. And that's a good way of doing it. So you're never actually directly planting into your decorative container. Your container can stay there, but and your neighbors will think by magic you have these planters always looking fresh and always looking well, but you're doing this behind the scenes. And a way of doing that, for example, would be get your cheap grow pot, you fill that with beautiful crocuses early on. So now you're in the early part of the year, these crocuses are in full flower, you pop them in, and they look spectacular for a few weeks. Behind the scenes in your little propagation area or around the side of a shed, you have your narcissus ready to go. And when the crocuses are going over and your narcissus or your daffodils are actually coming into flower, you magically pop out the crocuses and pop in your next pot. You have behind that again, you have your tulips coming. And by doing that, it's a way of, I suppose, staging the house or staging the patio or whatever it is. And it takes a little bit of planning, I guess, but it really is a simple way of doing it. So it's so easy to plant up the bulbs. So you'll do that in minutes, and then you just leave them. And as they're ready to give off their show or put their, I suppose, stamp on the spring, you bring them forward, bring them to the peak of the house, and then you're going to get that 3-4 weeks out of those. At that stage, then you whip them off and bring in your next lot. And I think that's a really good way of doing it. And with that, then you avoid this situation where you're looking at kind of leaves that are dying back and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really important for the bulbs for the following year. So with the exceptions of tulips, all of these bulbs, as the leaves and as the stalks die back, they die back into the bulb itself, and that gives it its energy to split and divide. It also gives it its energy to come forward and flower the following year. So that part is critical. And in the bulb lasagna, you either have to cut them off to keep the thing looking fresh, or you bunch them up, or whatever the case may be, which takes from the look of the container. But in the way that I'm talking about, you can take them back around the side after they've gone past their peak, let them die back in most cases. And it's advisable, say you're taking your crocuses or your daffodils and they finish flowering and all you're left with is green, a good feed of seaweed, a little bit of nutrient into that, and that will help those bulbs, make them stronger. They'll take it into the bulb, and that'll give you even better bulbs for the following year. So I think that kind of staging is a really good way of doing it. It doesn't take much planning. It just takes a little bit of work early in the season, then pop them around the side, and then all you're doing is switching pots. And as I said earlier, your neighbors will come in and say, "Oh God, your pots look brilliant all the time," but it's clever work behind the scenes that's doing this. And I find that is, it's a better idea than than the lasagna planting, unless you're stuck for space. So that's I suppose another way of doing it. Just something to mention there, and I suppose it's something that people need to think about and people need to consider. Tulips, and they are, I would say, probably up there as being the most famous. They're certainly the one that's sold the most in terms of spring bulbs, spring flowering bulbs. There is a problem with them in my eyes, and you will notice it that you'll get your tulips, you'll plant them, you will typically get one good year out of them, and then the next year they'll be a little bit, they won't be as good. You might get some flower, but it'll probably be at least a quarter to a half less flower than you had in year one with them, and they also don't hold their shape. So that's basically what I find with almost all tulips. And then you get into the next year and they're no good. And a lot of them are carrying disease. A lot of them underperform. If you're planting them in the ground and you have been do so for a number of years, you can get a buildup of a disease in the ground. So even in year one, you may not get a superb effect. But I don't think that there's any great longevity in the standard tulips that you're going to see. And for that reason, I don't like them. I think there's better ways of doing it. You know, the species tulips, they're not necessarily your typical tulip look, but species tulips will naturalize, will multiply, and I think they're a good option. Some of the apple dorns will give good flower and will come back, will multiply, will naturalize. Some of those, so that's worth looking out for, is the apple dorn ones. But generally tulips, while they give a fantastic display in year one, I think, you know, there's question marks over whether it's a good practice to be, you know, knowingly planting these that you're going to get 1 year out of them, and bearing in mind that I said this is, you know, tulips, a single variety of tulips is going to flower for 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a max. That's a very, very short window, you know, for the amount of effort that goes into getting it to your pot or your garden. So it's just something to consider. But there is options, you know, species tulips and apple dorns and so on. So they're really good ones. Just to talk about naturalizing then, as I mentioned, what naturalizing is when bulbs spread and multiply, and then they naturalize an area, and good ones for that. This can be used in lawn areas, for example, grassy areas. Can also be used with certain types of bulbs under trees. And, you know, there's a lot of different ones, a lot of different bulbs that can be used. So we're looking at things like narcissus, daffodils. They will naturalize, they will spread. One thing with those, though, is that you will need to sort of split the clump and divide the clump over time, because eventually they're just not able to spread themselves far enough. So you will need to split the clump and divide it up every so often. And that will help flowering and will also move it to other areas of the garden. Crocuses will naturally naturalize an area, so they will keep spreading by their own accord. They're a really good one. Snowdrops as well. Snowdrops are less successful when planted from autumn bulbs than they are when they're planted in the green. I've mentioned that before. In the green basically means that they've sprouted up. You won't get these now until the spring, but in the green, in the springtime, it's a really good way of planting snowdrops. You will get flower from them planted from autumn bulbs, but it's a slower process. So a really good way of doing snowdrops is buying them in the green. Bluebells, again, a really good one for naturalizing, particularly good in woodland or under trees. Same with the snowdrops, again, useful around trees, not in deep shade, but certainly around the outskirts of it. Bluebells, just the best variety is non-scripta. That's the true English bluebell, native to Ireland. So non-scripta, that's the one to go for. Others that are good for naturalizing are Scilla saberica, muscaris, fritillarias, Iris reticulata, those type ones. They're all good for naturalizing and for spreading. And so you can plant up an area and that will continue to flower, expand, look better, grow, naturalize over time. And they're great bulbs for that purpose. The other thing, just mentioning your containers and your planting of containers, we spoke about it a few weeks ago. If you're doing, your bulb lasagna or whatever, and you're looking for something to have it looking pretty good now, then top off the pot with the likes of violas or pansies or polyanthus, those type things, for a bit of flower through the autumn, through the winter, and then wait for the flowers, for the bulbs to pop up in the springtime. We covered it a couple of weeks ago anyway, but that's a good one. There's no point in potting these up if it's going to be, your decorative pot in the position that you're going to leave it in. There's no point in having it there just sitting with a compost looking top on it at this time of the year. You might as well get some flower in it and get it looking good for now. Using the other system where I was talking about, where you're dropping in and out your planter, it's less. You'll need to do that less. In a scenario like that, you would possibly have your sort of inner pot potted up now with your violas and whatever else. Pop that in, leave that there all over late autumn through the early part of winter, and then your crocuses maybe might be the first ones to come. So you'll pop out your pots there, do a switch, and that's a good way of doing it. And not to forget those when it comes to your planting at this time of the year. That's kind of the big thing. If you're looking for flower over a long period, as I said earlier, it really is important to get different varieties. If you get all the same variety, you're going to have flower for that period, and that's it. And the same goes if you're trying to naturalize a big area outside. Try and get, if you're using daffodils as an example, try and get different varieties with different flower periods, and that'll give you longevity of color over the time period. Because most of them you're only going to get that few weeks of actual flower from an individual variety. So by getting different varieties with different flower periods, you're going to extend that. When you're talking about the naturalizing, and as the example I just used there, where you're planting lots of daffodils, say, into a grass area, it's funny because, as I said, it's important that the leaf and the stalk die back into the bulb. But when you're doing it, if you're doing it in lasagna planting, it can look untidy and that. But when you're out in a grass area, that dying back just looks natural because you're against a grass background. So it looks totally natural, doesn't look out of place, doesn't look tidy. And that's where you get the benefit by having different flowering ones. They catch your eye and you're not looking at just the green stalks. So that's really important. Use the best quality bulbs that you can. Don't buy any that have any rot in them if they feel soft. Don't buy them. You once they get into the ground or into the potting mix, they'll just die back. So really important to use good quality bulbs. And that point I mentioned about at the end of the season, if you're intending to keep these for the following year, give them a good feed of seaweed. Put them away at the back of a shed. You can actually forget about them for a little while, and then they'll be perfect again. Come next autumn time, they'll be perfect again for planting in somewhere else or moving somewhere else in the garden. So just, I suppose, initially give them that good feed after they've gone over. So that that's kind of this week's episode. There's lots to be doing. You're looking at snowdrops, crocuses, tulips, daffodils, narcissus, bluebells, hyacinths, alliums, ranunculus, scilla, scaries. All of those, they are such a an easy way to garden. With no green fingers, with no gardening experience, you can have perfect flower, perfect displays from bulbs. They're probably the easiest way for somebody to get into gardening, I guess. And I don't know that it's possible to fail with them. Just following a few simple tips. Make sure that you're using a well-drained potting mix. Definitely the staging or the bringing out of a pot is a good way, I think, if you have the space to do it. Lasagna planting, by all means, if you need to. But I wouldn't jump on that phase just because it's, I suppose it's kind of a really popular trend at the moment. People doing videos of lasagna planting. Not saying it doesn't have its place, not saying it doesn't have its purpose, it absolutely does. But there is, I think, other ways of doing it that might be just more useful for your garden. So next week's episode is a really interesting episode, joined by Jennifer Jewell, talking all about seeds basically, and I suppose it's a review of her new book. It will open your eyes to certain things around seeds that I suppose you might not have known, and it really is eye-opening and worth catching up. So that's next week's episode. That's been this week's episode, all about autumn planting spring flowering bulbs. Everybody can do it. There's nothing difficult about it. You really, really can, whether you're green-fingered or not, have great success from these, and choosing the right bulbs. You'll have flowers for years and years to come that will multiply, that will naturalize, that will get better over time. So that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.